Welcome to Unrestrained, the podcast series from CPI. Here you can enjoy conversations where professionals on all sides of crisis and behavior management relax and open up about themselves, their workplace, and their clients. You'll get the latest tips and trends from the best in the business, so tune in often to integrate their experiences with your own. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Unrestrained, the CPI podcast series. This is your host, Terry Vitone, and I'm joined today by Kendra Stea. Kendra is a nationally certified counselor and CPI's Director of Client Services. Hello and welcome, Kendra.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to talk with Kendra about her 13 plus years working with CPI as well as her own personal history, and that brings me to our first question today on Unrestrained. Kendra, in your article, 7 Essential Elements of Healthcare Excellence, you wrote, people enter the caring profession because they want to give back, because they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves, because they feel called to do so. In light of those observations, talk about your career path and personal experiences and kind of what brought you here today.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, as I was growing up, you take all these career aptitude tests, and everything told me I was either going to be a pastor or a farmer or a social worker. And so at the end of the day, I ended up kind of going the social work route, getting a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and then eventually a master's degree in counseling. But
Are you Wisconsin native?
Yeah, for the most part. Born and raised on a dairy farm in central Wisconsin, hence the aptitude toward farming.
I see.
Yeah. And so right after college, I went to work in a group home for youth. My aspiration was to become a victim witness coordinator in the court system. But the jobs are few and far between, and they're often filled internally by other county employees or things of that nature.
So how is that's a support role for people that have been victimized in crimes?
Correct. Helping them navigate the court system, making sure they have the right resources. They're prepared to maybe be in a courtroom with the person who victimized them. Just really being an advocate and a support for people who are either victims or witnesses of crime.
Sounds like we can use more of those people.
Yeah, I think it's a really critical role in the court system. So I started working at this group home for teenagers who'd been adjudicated or found guilty of certain crimes and removed from their home, and I fell in love. I didn't mean to. I didn't even know I liked children that much.
Oh my God.
And on my second day of employment in a group home, somebody handed me a video and said, "You're going to get some training, but this will get you started. Why don't you watch this video?" And it was CPI's The Art of Setting Limits. And it changed immediately the way I looked at how I was going to interact with these teenagers, who I was pretty sure I could make them do anything. I was the adult, right?
Right.
The one in charge, right? So that's kind of how it all got started. It was quite by accident. And, over time, through a series of jobs working with mostly youth and some adults in group care or residential treatment settings, transitioning out of corrections back into the community.
Do you remember the aha moment when you said, "Oh, this is me. This is really what I want to do"?
I don't. I wish I could say all of a sudden it was clear to me, but it felt right. I think right away from the beginning, it just was a good fit for me. Like I said, I took the job because I needed a job and I wasn't sure, and immediately it was just the right fit. It was just the right fit.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so then you became aware of CPI through Setting Limits, the presentation. And how did you eventually get to CPI from the home that you were counseling in?
Well, that organization used CPI's Nonviolent Crisis Intervention training program, so I eventually was trained in the program. I left that organization and went to Lutheran Social Services of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan, and they too used CPI's training program. And there came a point in time during my tenure with them where they needed an instructor for the group homes that I was supervising at the time. And so I volunteered to become the trainer because I liked the content. So I went through the instructor certification course. I began training for the staff in our group homes. And then we recognized that we had a group of staff that didn't really have a duty to care, or they were working in partnership with schools, but their job wasn't really, they weren't the caregiver. And so at the time, CPI had an offering called Street Smart from 9 to 5, which has since been kind of repackaged into our Prepare training program. And now it's much more robust than it was then. So I went to get a dual certification, and it was at that program where I said to the instructor, how do I get to be one of you? How would I work for CPI? Because I really liked taking the knowledge, the skills, the simple strategies, and just passing those along to my staff, and then watching them in those crisis moments just completely resolve things in a way that was successful, and so we never had to put our hands on anybody.
Yeah.
And she said, send your resume. And so I did.
Was that 2001?
Yes, and that was in 2001, or late 2000. I sent my resume, went through the interview process, and started as a global professional instructor then in 2001.
Did you take to the teaching, the role of a GPI?
Yeah.
Right away?
Yeah, I did. So I trained actively for about 3.5 years, but really felt called and compelled to some other things CPI was doing. I miss training. I loved being on the road. I love interacting with our clients and our customers and watching those light bulb moments that they have. But we're a growing company. We've been growing, and so there were so many other opportunities to get involved with that have really led to a place I feel like I can help people change their culture, and that's a big impact. And it's been a very fulfilling shift then.
Well, that's and I'm glad you brought that up. In the time that you've been here, what's the biggest sort of cultural turnaround that you've been involved with when you go? Well, maybe we could talk a little bit more how national accounts sort of evolved, how your role transitioned to Director of Client Services.
Sure. I think over time we recognized we had certain accounts at CPI that were very large scale, like span nationwide. How we typically sell is based on geography. Our account managers have a state they're assigned to or a province they're assigned to. But there are those organizations, they tend to be large integrated health systems and or mental health systems that have locations in multiple states that were large utilizers of our offerings. And so we recognize there might be an opportunity for us to better support those types of organizations, or even to try to speak with their corporate level to get a corporate level contract or some buy-in and support so that all facilities could freely use our offerings without having to go through a bunch of red tape, or to help consolidate buying efforts, to save them time and money. And they've really been open to that kind of relationship with CPI.
I see.
And so the more we started to do that, we saw the effects of that kind of relationship with those organizations, and so we decided we needed to make a department or a couple positions really designated towards supporting those large nationwide accounts. And so it's really evolved into this really nice thing of a group of us who work not only at the individual facility level, but also have these corporate relationships as well. So we work bottom up and top down to shape their entire workplace violence prevention policy, essentially across their whole system.
Right. You want to talk about a specific client for that?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. So as an example, probably now 2 years ago, I started to have a dialogue with Ascension Health. They are located out of St. Louis, Missouri, but they have about 120 hospitals across the nation. And they do some long-term care homes as well. And, like most health systems, they're merging and consolidating and growing, day by day. And they really, really wanted to start to address this issue of violence in healthcare. It gets a lot of press, but there's not a lot of resources out there. And so we started to dialogue about what would that look like to do a system-wide approach, not just of formal training, but of informal components, so that everybody in the facility might get some level of an awareness about what workplace violence is and how to prevent it from occurring. And so we've expanded our training presence from a formal capacity into many of their health ministries, is what they're called. But we're also working on some informal components with them to put out on their LMS so that every associate in their employment will have access to. One is a very specific healthcare video that was actually filmed in one of their facilities using scenarios that they helped us create and write, that is focusing on preventive techniques. And then we did 2 e-seminar series. One is on workplace bullying, and one is on domestic violence and how it impacts the workplace. These are issues and concerns they've identified are their highest risk areas. Patient-to-patient violence, patient-to-staff violence, visitor-guest violence.
So you, in your planning stage as director, you go in and meet and sort of partner with the executive or the decision makers there and say what's hurting you or what's, and they then come back. Do you ever, do you sometimes take an assessment and look and say, well, you could also do this as well? That's
exactly. I mean, some organizations, when we come together as partners, already have a really good feel for what they need or what they want to try to change in their culture, and others really are starting from ground zero and they're not sure. And so the first step, right, is to sit down, have a dialogue, kind of figure out what their goals are, and then how can we be a partner to them in achieving those outcomes.
And how long have we talked with Ascension?
It's been 2.5 years now, and it's still kind of rolling out. The e-seminars and the preventive techniques video are all in pilot right now. The training is, slowly expanding across the health ministries. So it's been a really nice relationship, and then they've had to make other changes that are connected but not necessarily related to us, like an improved reporting system for incidents. And so then there was an education piece of making sure associates know the proper way to report and record workplace violence of all different kinds. And they put together threat assessment protocols and risk assessment protocols. So it's been this really comprehensive workplace violence prevention approach that's really been great to be a part of.
That initiative was developed in connection with CPI then as we went through. I've read about Waypoint Center up in Canada, and that's also, could you shine a light on that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so Waypoint Center for Mental Health is in Ontario, and it's the facility, or it's huge, right? They have like 8,000 employees, but the facility houses the province's most chronically mentally ill individuals. They serve individuals who have been adjudicated or found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. These are individuals who cannot live in the community. And a couple of years ago now as well, they put out a request for proposal after dialoguing with some training vendors to really put together a comprehensive culture change plan that included training, both formal and informal, that included some consultation pieces. And what was really interesting about this environment is that they're very sure they're very unique, right? They're unique. No one else is like them. And there's some truth in that. However, what we really had to work to do is help them see how what we had really can work for them. By their own admission, they were using some fairly coercive practices when individuals were in crisis. They were using elements of pain compliance and physical coercion during crisis that just are no longer acceptable best practice.
Well, who's been the most dramatic sort of turnaround that you've seen?
Well, I mean, it happens a lot.
If that's a fair question.
Yeah, right, it happens a lot. But I mean, I think a good example is the folks at Waypoint. In working with them, I knew that it was going to be a challenging group for a lot of reasons, and it had really little to do with the actual individuals and more to do with the culture that had developed at the organization. And so the trainers that were selected...
Can you describe that culture just a little bit?
Yeah, it's very paramilitary, very... they are the largest employer in a small community, so it's also... very generational within families. My grandmother worked at Waypoint, and my uncle works at Waypoint, and my cousins work there with me, and it's my job too. And so as things would change, there's that pressure from family members or friends of, well, when I worked there, we did it that way, and so there was, it's steeped in tradition is really what's going on there, right? It's completely steeped in tradition. And it's also had a history of kind of, what's our soup of the day intervention we're going to try now, or thing we're going to change now, that for many staff they felt like never got staying power. Like they'd do some things different, and everybody'd say, this is how we're going to do it, and then it would just go away.
So a treatment du jour that no one really bought into at a practical level.
Exactly. or just, even things that staff wanted to see changed. Yes, we're going to change them, and then it just never really wouldn't stick.
Mm-hmm.
So they really were concerned that this was just another one of those initiatives that would require them to put a lot of work in at the front end and would never be supported.
Do you know this going in?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so that's got to be a mental, talk about steep.
Yeah, it's tough because the instructors, when they come to our program, from any location, are putting so much effort and energy into learning a new curriculum, but also then preparing to go deliver it to a bunch of people. And in this case, they all knew that they were going to be the pariahs, right? They were going to come with this curriculum that was called Nonviolent Crisis Intervention, and they were going to get nothing but resistance from their team members. And frankly, that's where they started. So I handpicked some of our very best trainers, that can handle that kind of resistance. But I think my favorite example was one of the instructor candidates in the middle of the first day looked at Pam Sikorsky, who's one of our best GPIs, and said, "This is a bunch of
hooey."
Yeah.
Sorry.
He totally used an explicit word that we won't use here, but he said, "This will never work for us."
Wow. And how do you combat that sort of...
Yeah, and that was one of several people with that attitude. Waypoint took this really interesting approach, which has really, really been effective for them, and I really highly recommend it, in that they certified a group of trainers, but then they also had us deliver training to a group of individuals that they handpicked that were called coaches. And these coaches' role isn't to teach or train, but it's to help be the eyes and ears of the trainers, so that during the implementation phase, as they're rolling out this new strategy, they have a lot of people that can coach and help people remember, but they can also make little mental notes of, we need to practice something over here, and in this unit we need to do a refresher on limit setting, and we didn't debrief this incident, and we should have, and so they can feed that information back to the trainers as part of a gap analysis for planning next year's training, or to plan to come into a unit and do a drill, or to do a review, or to spend some extra time with some staff that need some mentoring or coaching on de-escalation and limit setting. So it really has been this nice model, but so not only did Pam have these 12 trainers, but then she had 25 coaches that were all of this mindset of, this will never work for us. I've worked with Pam for a long time. I mean, she's been at the organization just about a year less than me, and she said this was the hardest training she's ever done. But within 6 months of them beginning the training anyway.
And beginning was January 2013?
We first certified them, I want to say, February, March of 2013. Okay. They started their training of their staff in April or May. And by, mid-fall, they had trained already about 700 staff. So it was intensive training in both our basic course and our applied physical training course. And that same trainer came up to me and he says, "Kendra, I'm a changed person."
Oh my God.
He said, "I like to come to work now. I feel like I'm making a difference in people's lives." He said, "I don't know what's happened to me. My wife doesn't know what's happened to me." And it was
so profound changing.
Hugely profound. He said to me once, he said, "I used to always be number 1 or 2 in on the crisis," meaning they'd call a code, he'd go, he'd be one of the first 2 people to enter into a physical situation. And he said, the other day we were standing there, and this gentleman in the day room was getting really agitated, and he was pacing around, and he was trying to pick stuff up to kind of throw it, and being very loud and cursing and threatening. And the team kept saying, "Well, let's go." And I just said, "No, we don't have to do this." He said, and we waited it out because he wasn't hurting anybody. He said, and we didn't have to restrain, and it resolved itself. He said, "Now I come to work and I know I have a different way. I don't have to put my hands on people to keep control in the unit." So to hear just those testimonies of...
it strikes me that, to put it back into this lockup where there are some, There are some tough cases. There are some hard cases, right?
Absolutely.
And to imagine somebody after less than a year of this training has gone in and said, "Let them go." That's remarkable to turn around.
Yeah.
And have you seen stats that they keep regarding restraint and seclusion?
I am going up in a few weeks and hope to see a little bit more of that. But the initial reports are that injuries are down, restraint use is down. I don't have the percentages yet, but by all accounts, it's been a very positive change. It's not still without resistance, because on top of changing our kind of clinical programming and changing our behavior management programming, they also built this very large, brand new, state-of-the-art building that then they had to move into with all these different bells and whistles and quite frankly, more space and a beautiful location where every patient will have a view of the Georgian Bay and just very much more warm and welcoming than the old building they were in. But in that, staff were concerned about giving up a level of environmental control that they experienced in their old building because it was tight quarters and confined spaces. So it gives this feel to staff of safety and control. And now they were going to open that up and have more space for people to roam around or more places for people to go cool off or more options. But that was
also more territory to police.
Yeah, absolutely. More territory to monitor, to watch for those signs of anxiety. And they were just very concerned about how that would all go. But the move went really well, and one of the VPs told me the other day they've already just experienced another shift in that reduction of incidents and, disruptive moments because of the new environment. That immediately people were just breathed a big sigh of relief, and that it's been good.
So it's more space for them as well.
Everybody, right?
Maybe you'll talk to us again when you come back.
Yeah, that'd be great.
What do you see out there that makes you more or less optimistic that the models at CPI can catch on in a greater degree and accomplish less restraint and seclusion and just a more peaceful and productive workspaces for people?
I think one of the more promising things in my tenure here at CPI has been to watch the amount of legislative activity around the issue. When I first started for CPI, it was just the beginning of people recognizing the real dangers of restraint use. It was unregulated, it was underreported, or not reported at all. And, Eric Weiss had just broken the news in his Hartford Courant, series called Deadly Restraint about the issue, and where the General Accountability Office had done some research and figured there were 150 deaths that were related to restraint each year, and those were just those that kind of got reported as such. Over the last, 13 and a half years that I've been at CPI, I've watched the awareness around the risks of restraint use grow, and with that has come this beautiful transition of care practices to be more person-centered, trauma-informed, just positive behavior supports, everything being integrated in a way that has moved us from coercive environments into collaborative and cooperative environments. And that's been across our markets, whether it's schools or hospitals or mental health or human service organizations. The advocacy groups standing up and fighting for the rights of individuals that are in care. The legislative transitions that are now requiring a higher level of monitoring and reporting and training for staff.
So kind of an age of an enlightenment so far as people who might be subject to restraint and seclusion. Yeah,
it really has been. And I think also for a long time we did a disservice to employees in these high-risk environments because they weren't trained in what to do. And none of crisis intervention is really intuitive. It is not intuitive for me to stay calm, professional, rational when somebody's swearing at me, threatening me, throwing stuff at me, or trying to kick me or hit me. And I've been in that position, where I've got a kid across from me and the trash can comes flying and the foot is next. And And I'm expected to respond in a way that keeps him safe, that keeps me safe, that will help him calm down eventually and keep everyone else safe in the meantime, and I'm the only worker at a group home. I mean, that is a challenge for any professional. And I was fortunate because the organization I work for, by licensing requirements, but also by ethics, felt it was important and necessary to train me. And so they did. But every day at CPI, we get calls from individuals who've never been trained.
Did you take to the models immediately when you were presented with them?
It just made sense.
Yeah.
It's simple, it's easy to digest, and easy to quickly apply. And that's one thing that I really like about our curriculums is that it's just so practical. It's not complicated to do or to use. It's principle-based, so I can take the concept and apply it in any situation. So whether I'm in a school classroom or whether I'm in a mental health unit.
Sounds like once people internalize the models, they can become almost intuitive.
Yeah.
Is there some element of our coursework, the CPI coursework, that you that you continually wish people did, maybe dug a little deeper, or some aspect, or any observation really that you'd like to share about the program that you find salient or interesting?
I am often talking with people about changing the culture. I mean, we can train staff and we can check a box and say we've done it, but that won't necessarily impact our outcomes. And I've had the great fortune to work with several institutions who have completely eliminated restraint or seclusion. And in every success story, there's one common variable. I mean, you can change up a lot of things and get there, but the one thing that has to be present if you are going to eliminate or significantly reduce your restraint and seclusion, it's a commitment to debriefing every single incident that occurs. I think we are good about debriefing with the individual in our care that was in crisis. We want to reintegrate them into the milieu or get them back into the classroom. So we talk about what happened and we help them think of different strategies on how they might behave next time. And we look for the patterns and we do functional behavioral assessments and try to make new behavior plans. But as a group of staff that are called to intervene daily in those situations, we too need to sit down and say, what worked for us? What didn't? Because otherwise we get stuck in this pattern of doing the same thing day after day and expecting a different result, which I'm fairly confident is the definition of insanity.
Yes.
And how do we expect the individuals in our care to change their behavior if we don't change ours? If we're not willing to take a look at our own behaviors and how they might have influenced both positively and negatively that situation, so that we're better tomorrow too. And so that element of our curriculum, it's the last unit, it gets shortchanged because of time, energy, and it's a commitment that you have to make as an organization to take the time to do it. But when you do, that's how you prevent it, in the future. Post-prevention becomes prevention.
Do you have anything else we should go over, you thinking? How are we on time? We're about half an hour. I think that's about right. Well, that concludes this episode of Unrestrained. I'd like to thank our guest, Kendra Stea. She's the Director of Client Services here at CPI, and we thank you for listening in. Kendra, thanks.
Thank you.
All
Anytime.
Right. Thank you for listening to Unrestrained. Tune in again on July 30th for our second episode featuring Susan Keith, intrepid CPI veteran and Director of Curriculum Development. Until then, this is your host, Terry Vitone, hoping your intention is prevention.